In the winter of 1349, an entire village ceased to live in a single night. There were no screams to break the darkness, no blood spilled, and no signs of struggle left behind. When dawn finally came, the houses still stood as they always had, doors closed, food left untouched, fires long gone cold. Yet every person who had been breathing only hours before was now dead. To understand how silence itself can kill, we must return to that forgotten village, hidden in the far reaches of northern Europe. It was a modest place, distant from trade routes and largely forgotten by the world beyond its forests. The people there were not untouched by hardship, but they understood it. Hunger and winter were familiar enemies. Rumors reached them in fragments. Travelers spoke of distant towns closed by fear, of bells that rang endlessly, of a sickness that emptied streets overnight. The stories were unsettling yet vague, and the village remained convinced that whatever troubled the wider world would not reach them. Disasters had always passed nearby, not through. As night approached, the villagers withdrew indoors. Fires burned low. Meals were eaten in near silence. A child fell asleep at the table. A mother whispered a prayer. An old man stared into the flames longer than usual. Nothing felt wrong, only unusually still. Outside, the wind faded, and even the forest seemed to hold its breath. By the time the last candle was blown out, the village had surrendered to sleep, unaware that this ordinary winter night marked the final moment of life as it had always known it. Before dawn, everything would be different. Night fell quietly over the village, without warning or ceremony. The sky darkened early, wrapped in thick winter clouds that swallowed what little light remained. One by one, windows dimmed as candles were lit inside the houses, their weak glow barely pushing back the cold pressing against the walls. Families retreated indoors sooner than usual. Doors were closed, wooden bolts slid into place. Fires were fed sparingly, for fuel was precious in winter, and no one knew how long the cold would last. Supper was simple: bread, thin stew, silence. Conversations were brief and subdued, as if words themselves had grown heavy. Nothing appeared wrong. No one coughed. No one cried out in pain. No bells rang. Yet the stillness felt different. The air inside the houses seemed thick, unmoving. Outside, the wind faded completely, leaving the village wrapped in an unnatural calm. According to a later account, not even the dogs stirred that night. The forest beyond the last house stood frozen, branches unmoving, as though it too were waiting. Inside one home, a child fell asleep near the fire, his breath slow and steady. In another, an elderly woman whispered a final prayer, more out of habit than fear. Somewhere else, a man lay awake longer than he meant to, troubled by a vague sense of pressure in his chest, a discomfort he blamed on the cold. Then, gradually, the village surrendered to sleep. No cries pierced the night. No struggle followed. Whatever entered the village did not force its way in. It arrived gently, invisibly, like breath drawn in and never released. By midnight, the last candle had burned out, and the village was no longer awake to witness what had come. Morning arrived, but the village did not wake. In the neighboring settlement, just beyond the frozen fields, people noticed the absence first, not as fear, but as confusion. No smoke rose from the chimneys across the valley. No distant sounds carried on the air. By mid-morning, the silence had become impossible to ignore. One man was sent to investigate. He crossed the fields alone, his footsteps crunching softly against the snow. As he drew closer, the village appeared unchanged. Houses still stood. Doors were still shut. Nothing seemed broken or disturbed. And yet, something was wrong. The first door he pushed open offered no resistance. Inside, the fire had long gone cold. Bread sat untouched on the table, hardened by the night air. A woman lay slumped on a bench, her hands folded as if she had simply paused to rest. Her eyes were open. She did not move. In the next house, a man lay on his bed, blankets pulled up neatly to his chest. In another, a child rested beside his mother, their bodies still, their faces pale and frozen in expressions that suggested neither pain nor struggle. Room after room, the same scene repeated itself. No blood stained the floors. No furniture was overturned. No marks of violence could be found. Even the animals lay dead in their stalls, exactly where they had been left the night before. The man stumbled back into the open air, his breath coming fast now, his hands trembling. What he had found could not be explained, not by sickness he understood, not by any enemy he could name. The village had not been attacked, it had simply stopped. By the afternoon, the news had spread. Men from nearby villages arrived cautiously, stopping at the edge of the settlement, as if the ground itself might be dangerous. They covered their mouths with cloth, avoided touching the walls, and spoke only in whispers. No one wanted to stay longer than necessary. They searched the houses carefully. There were no broken doors, no overturned tables, no signs of a struggle. The dead bore no wounds. Their skin showed no cuts, no bruises, no marks that could explain such a sudden end. Faces remained strangely calm, as though life had left them without resistance. Some appeared to have died in sleep, others while sitting, waiting, praying. A priest accompanied the men, moving slowly from room to room. He murmured prayers under his breath and recorded what he saw in a small leather-bound book. His hands shook as he wrote. Later, in the margin of that record, he added a single line. This was not death by blade or fire. It came without sound. Even the animals offered no explanation. Cattle lay stiff in their stalls. Chickens were found where they had settled for the night. Death had not spared them either. Speculation spread quickly, but answers did not. Some whispered of poison in the air. Others spoke of divine punishment, a warning sent without mercy. A few refused to speak at all, convinced that naming the cause might invite it closer. What frightened them most was not the number of dead, it was the speed. Whatever had passed through the village had left nothing behind, no trail, no warning, no clear enemy. Only bodies, silence, and a growing certainty that this was not an ordinary tragedy. Something unseen had moved through the night, and it could move again. By the following days, the villagers from nearby towns began to understand what had happened. The village had not been destroyed by men, nor by fire, nor by famine. It had fallen victim to something far more silent and invisible. Some called it a sickness, others a curse. Even the priests hesitated to name it aloud, fearing that words might summon it anew. Whichever name they used, the effect was the same. Bodies claimed in hours, leaving nothing behind but stillness and cold. The plague moved like a shadow, unseen and unstoppable. It struck without warning, taking the young and the old, the strong and the weak alike. A farmer asleep in his bed, a child clasping his mother's hand, a man muttering prayers by the fire, all succumbed within the night. No cries, no struggle, only the quiet passage from life to death. Those who arrived after the night spoke of the air itself, heavy, almost tangible, as if the village exhaled a breath that carried death. The animals, too, were gone, fallen where they stood, untouched by claws or teeth. Even the forest seemed to recoil, trees stiff, windless, as if holding its breath. Some villagers swore they saw shadows moving along the walls, or glimpsed faces in windows that should have been dark. Others told of a chill that ran through the bones, a cold beyond the winter, a sense that the unseen had been present and watching. The priests wrote down what they could, though many left gaps in their accounts. Some sections of the manuscript were smudged or torn, as if the fear of the event had reached the ink itself. Whatever it was, the plague had no face, no roar, no knife, no smoke. It came like a whisper, like the air itself, and left behind nothing but silence. By the end of the week, the neighboring villagers could no longer bear the silence. Fear had taken root in their hearts, thick and unyielding. They gathered at the edge of the snow-covered fields, staring at the village that had once been alive. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys, no laughter echoed from doorways. The stillness was almost tangible, as if the land itself held its breath in dread. They sent a priest among them, a man whose hands had grown accustomed to blessing and comforting. He walked slowly, counting the houses, peering inside, whispering prayers over every body. The villagers followed in silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. Each room was the same, people lying as if asleep, food left uneaten, no marks of struggle, no signs of violence. Even the animals lay dead where they had settled the night before. The air was bitter, and the cold seemed to bite deeper than any winter frost. Finally, the villagers conferred. No one spoke of disease or curse. The words felt too weak for what they faced. Instead, fear itself became their guide. They decided that nothing should remain of that place, not a roof, not a wall, not a body. It was not only the plague they feared, but the unknown that had entered uninvited, leaving behind a silence that could haunt them forever. The village was set aflame. Fires roared through the wooden homes, licking the snow with orange and red. Smoke curled into the sky like fingers of warning. Some villagers wept, others remained stone-faced, unable to reconcile grief with relief. By nightfall, the entire settlement had been consumed. The wind carried the ashes across the fields, scattering what little remained. The cross that marked the village's edge was left standing, a solitary witness. And in the whispers of those who survived, the story was told again, that some deaths come not with cries, but with silence, and that silence can linger longer than any memory of life. Years passed, but the land where the village once stood remained empty. No crops grew, no animals grazed, and no traveler dared linger. Only a solitary wooden cross marked the place, leaning slightly under the weight of snow and time. The earth seemed unwilling to remember life that had once thrived there. Even the wind carried a peculiar quiet, as if the silence of that night had seeped into the soil itself. Local people whispered that in winter nights, when the moon hid behind clouds and the forest exhaled frost, one could feel the presence of those who had vanished. Some swore they saw faint shadows moving among the ruins of ash and stone. Others claimed they heard a soft exhale, a breath not carried by any living being. It was not a sound of danger, but a lingering memory, a pulse of the lives that had ended too swiftly, too silently. Priests wrote that the village had become a place of reflection, a grim reminder that death need not be loud to be complete. Travelers who passed by rarely spoke of it, and if they did, their voices trembled as though the very act of naming it might awaken something unseen. The plague, they said, had no face. It left no sign except the absence of everything it touched. Yet life continued around it. Forests grew taller, rivers ran deeper, and seasons cycled without mercy or notice. And still, on that forsaken patch of land, silence endured. It was a silence heavy with memory, patient and unyielding, a quiet so profound that it seemed to speak directly to the hearts of those who dared to listen. Somewhere beneath the snow and ash, the village waited, not alive, not dead, but eternal in its quiet. And the cross stood as a witness, unyielding, like the memory of a secret the world was not meant to understand.